last night on this 64 twin, I measured a lot of DC on the various cloth wires, and I really soaked everything, making sure I didn't get the labels of the Ajax caps, with isopropyl alcohol. And there's some old flux residue on the board here and there, but that's not that important. I'll clean all that up properly later. At this point, there's still DC on these wires. And I was going to try to show you the meter, but I couldn't get the meter in the shot very well for whatever reason. I'll try to hold it in place. Maybe you can see it. You know, it's if it's awkward, you just have to trust me. So on this B+ wire, 1.4 volts here, 3.5 volts there, basically. It's fluctuating, but 2 volts on the blue, almost 2 volts. All right, this one had a whole bunch of voltage before. Now it's down to 100 millivolts. So the alcohol last night did some good. Make sure it's not even on the grids a little bit. 800 millivolts on the wire to that grid. 300 millivolts on that wire. 300. So the alcohol did a good bit of good. Got 200 on a grid going to the phase inverter, 500 on the other grid in the phase inverter. Now these are millivolts, not volts I'm measuring. 300 on the cathode. Let's see, the grid's here. That's good. The other issue I run into, and remember this is with both channels down, if I tap on the chassis by this input jack, anywhere on the chassis really, yeah, we've got a very microphonic 6L6. I'm not going to give up on those yet, because if I can get them to work, they'll be great. So on those, I will remove them from the tube sockets, clean the tube sockets, and retension them, and then we'll see where we're at, because that's not always a bad tube. That can be just a bad connection, though it's not my preference. But before I deal with those microphonic tubes or anything like that, I really want to address this voltage. Now it's gone from 5 volts here last night to 2, almost 4 here. Actually, it's jumping up to 5 here. It changes as I move it. And I suspect that what's happening is that this bit of wire that's going beneath the board to this eyelet right here, each part of these wires goes beneath the board here. I bet there's a whole bunch of funk on the other side of that board, and that cloth has just soaked it up. And that was the part of the cloth that I could not easily access last night. All right, I removed those wires from beneath the board. And as you can see, this one, this old wire had 2 layers of cloth insulation, an inner layer and an outer layer. And I was measuring all that DC on the outer layer. Well, beneath the board, the outer layer cloth on this one had just disintegrated. It was just falling apart. And that all ties in my theory that moisture got trapped in that wire, in the cloth wire beneath the boards, between the top board and the insulator backing board. Now that I have these wires physically removed from this B+ node, which is at 436 volts DC, there is no voltage whatsoever on either yellow wire. And crucially, there's no more voltage on this blue wire that did have quite a few 100 millivolts on it. And I was getting like 5 volts on these. If anyone remembers what I said 5 minutes ago in the video as to what the actual voltage was. Anyway, it was like 5 volts and 2.5 volts. It was a lot of leakage. So let me take my insulated needle nose and attach these one at a time temporarily to this 436 volts. And now at the other node, I've got 417. And on this cloth wire where I did have 5 volts, I've now got 100 millivolts. And on this one, half a volt at worst. It fluctuates. And when I do that, the blue wire then has, it's this 400 millivolts. So this tells me a couple things that are good to know. By the way, I had the phase inverter pulled for this, otherwise you would have heard a horrible sound when I connected those wires to B+ temporarily. It tells me that the alcohol bath last night did a good bit of work, but it's not perfect, and that I was correct to pull these wires, and that that old wire beneath the board was probably full of corrosion. Now, I've got enough length here that I can connect it topside like the other two are done from the factory, and these two wires just won't go through this hole in the board anymore. And I can do another alcohol bath on these old wires and very likely get the rest of that leakage out, because voltage on this wire is getting into the blue wire. They're close to each other. I can unwind these. Let me power the amp off for a minute. I can unwind these wires and soak them individually in alcohol. Let that really, really dry out. And then wrap them again. And hopefully that will be enough to let me keep this old wire, which would probably not develop that same problem again for many, many years. You know, if I need to, I'll replace all this wire and it'll look like a particularly good example of factory. But before I do any of that, let me get the focus right. Where's my little, yeah, here we go. You can see all this nasty funk stuff on the board. Last night when I soaked everything in alcohol, it loosened this stuff up, but it didn't get it off the board because I just applied alcohol. And so what I want to do is get in here with some more alcohol. I don't have very much left. I got to go get some more. Just pour it in this area. And then wipe it up off the board, which will take a lot of those contaminants with it. Make sure you don't remove something original that's working just fine, thank you very much. At the same time, it's best not to hold these in too much, sorry about that, in too much reverence. Leo came out of amp repair, radio repair actually, and his designs, the primary genius in my opinion, was that he designed them to be serviced. He came from a service background. He designed his amps to be serviced. Ergo, ipso facto, he expected these amps to need servicing and to have parts replaced as necessary. And he would have thought you were nuts to say, keep in the old filter cap. He would say, those things have a rated lifetime, and you could probably quote all the specs better than I can. And he would change these out in a heartbeat. The difference between Leo and me is he would have probably done it using the cheapest available part on the market. I will spend the extra 30 cents here and there. It's funny when you look at the cost of making an amp really great from the factory. The parts difference between a pretty good amp and a great amp, maybe $20, $30 per amp. if that. So for an individual amp, the math is real simple. Make it really good. Spend that extra 20 bucks. When you're making hundreds of thousands of these things, that adds up, eats into your profit and blah, blah, blah. And once you have the rationale that only has to last a little bit past the warranty, and that warranty drops in length over the years, that's when the rot creeps in. Anyway, you can look at this board now that I've cleaned it and most of that funk is off. And it'll get another bath or two in the process. And while I have that out there, let me make sure that any moisture around this eyelet is driven out. This should be much better behaved when we put it back together. You can see I've got the board propped up with these screwdrivers, separating the actual board from the backer board and getting all these cloth wire leads going to the tubes off the chassis. And I soaked all that in alcohol and letting that dry. And this elevation, that gap there, really helps between the boards dry out as that alcohol evaporates. And I'm going to physically remove these yellow and blue wires as much as possible. So I can, especially the ones going from plate to plate, I can really soak. Some of them are actually being run beneath the board a little bit. They can't be fully pulled out unless, I mean, I can do it if it's absolutely necessary. I'm going to try to work with what I got. So the ones that can come out, gotta soak and let dry out in the sun. And the others, I will soak the areas that I can, and we will hope for the best. So it's really just turning into 2 of the yellow wires, which are B+ connections, and these are the most crucial. I'm going to get all the old contaminants out of these, and they can be retwisted. Let's see. What is the best way to soak these with isopropyl without it getting everywhere? Let's try a partial paper towel wrap. Let me get the seal off the new thing of alcohol. Sounds like a much more festive video than it is. With isopropyl, you don't want to sniff the cork. All right. So I'm going to try to do this. Try to contain the alcohol mostly in the cloth wire. And use a brush to steer it a little bit. Now that's not as thorough as the B+ wires will get, but this is, in theory, just an AC connection. And there should be no contamination of DC onto it unless there's a problem beneath the board. It's the 2 that I removed that are carrying DC that I think are contaminating everything else. What I'm doing here with the blue and the short yellow wire that are carrying AC may not, in fact, really be necessary. But it's always good to try everything that is feasible. Now I got a little bit, damn it, on these labels for these Ajax caps, which I try not to do with alcohol. But in my experience, if I don't mess with it at this point, they will evaporate and look just fine. You can see from the previous part of this video how much cleaner the board is in all these crucial areas. That's going to be very important down the line. I think I'm going to let this sit for about 15 more minutes propped up. It's been about 30, 40 minutes already that they've been like this because I had to run and get some more isopropyl from the store. And then I'm going to clean the preamp tube sockets and clean in retention the output tube sockets. But to do that, I've got to invert the chassis. I'm just going to let this sit right here. And these two yellow wires, I'm just going to take outside and really, I think I'm just going to dunk them in the thing of isopropyl and then let them sit in the sun and really dry out. And if I need to replace them, I have yellow wire that will look, it'll be new, but it'll be period correct new, if there's such a thing. If I were one of those crazy guys, I'd be out there trying to dip them in instant coffee or tea or kiwi shoe polish, but I might be introducing new things that are conductive. I'm just going to try to clean it, and if that's not possible, replace it properly. Well, it's all taken apart. As I mentioned, I'm going to be cleaning every pot casing that contacts chassis for ground, every input jack, and the part of the brass panel where all that connects. I've got the backer board pulled out and cleaned. It had all kinds of old residue on it. This is cleaned and ready to go back in. It just slides in if you're careful. And that bit of space between the bottom of the main board and the chassis right now is just helping all that evaporate. I've cleaned all the tube sockets. Before I get the inevitable question, I use isopropyl alcohol. I don't use deoxit in there because deoxit is conductive. If I have to really do a deep cleaning, I will use a bit of deoxit in the tube socket and then flush that with alcohol. I don't want any material in there other than the metal of the tube pin and the metal of the socket. You don't want to have anything in there that can be conductive, especially not WD-40, which people have used, and that's a great way to have all kinds of long-term unrepairable issues. The octal sockets have been cleaned, but they've also been retensioned, and that's just going in there with jewelers, screwdrivers, and a dental pick and making the little cups a little bit tighter, just moving the metal on each side just the slightest bit towards the middle. You don't want to overdo that or bend it out of shape, just so that when the tubes go in, they'll have better contact. Speaking of which, I will also very carefully examine the tube pins on each tube because these are all old RCAs. And if I see any residue or funk, I will get in there with a bit of deoxit or alcohol and clean that up. So I'm not going to show all this next process of putting it all back together because it's just long and tedious. And if you've seen enough of these videos, you'll have seen bits and pieces of how it's done along the way. I expect when this goes back together, hopefully all that stray DC is gone, which should hopefully, since we had DC on the grid wires, hopefully that'll take that DC off the volume pot and the volume pot of the guitar. I think that's where that was coming from. And I will know that we have good grounds for all the preamp circuit where those grounds are made to this front panel. So I'm going to stop this for here. That's a terrible sentence. I'm going to stop this at this point. We'll get the rest in the next video.